Hi everyone, you're watching BL Story of Love, the channel that brings you forbidden BL stories. This is the story of how an Omega under investigation was moved from a cell to house arrest under a strict Alpha warden, and how that very jailer became the only one who truly believed in his child. Don't forget to support the channel with a like and a subscription so you don't miss new forbidden BL stories that are impossible to tear yourself away from. Write in the comments what city you're watching from. Ren Harper had counted the bricks in his cell so many times that the pattern lived under his eyelids. When he closed his eyes, the wall rose in front of him, uneven and pitted, with the same cracked stone 3 rows from the floor and 2 bricks to the left, a private landmark in a place that was never meant to be his. Above, a narrow strip of window showed only sky and bars. The facility for so-called difficult Omegas did not waste sympathy. Every file here was a problem to be contained, not a story to be understood. On paper, Ren was nothing more than a line in the system: large-scale embezzlement, attempted escape, violation of a previous suspended sentence. A few phrases, a stamped name, and a confession that had once seemed like a lifeline and later turned into a chain. He knew his story did not fit into that dry paragraph. Years earlier, cornered by debts and bad choices, he had agreed to sign a statement that shifted part of the charges away from a small alpha gang he used to run errands for. They had promised him a softer regime, a quick appeal, protection if he took the blame for what they had done, and for what he had never touched. The day the judge read out the term, those promises evaporated. His lawyer looked away, the gang vanished from the courtroom like smoke, and the only thing that stayed real was the cold of the bench under his hands. In the Omega Wing, everything revolved around control. Hormones were flattened with suppressants handed out at fixed hours by a medic who never held anyone's gaze. Bodies were checked, weighed, recorded. Any sign of agitation went straight into the log. Ren had grown used to the dull ache behind his eyes from generic medication and to the way his body reacted to stress even when chemistry tried to force it into obedience. He no longer argued when a plastic cup of pills landed in his palm. Resistance only added new lines to the violation reports. His surname had stopped sounding like something alive. In incident summaries and daily updates, he was just a number followed by the word Omega. No protocol recorded how his family stopped answering his letters after the sentencing, how calls from the outside world dried up, how his former Alpha partner threw his belongings into the hallway and blocked him everywhere he could. In the eyes of staff, an Omega with a criminal record was already a solved problem, a box ticked and archived. Nights stretched the worst. After lights out, the block went quiet. But the silence was heavy, not peaceful. Somewhere down the corridor, someone coughed until they almost choked. Metal clanged, footsteps echoed, a shout rose and was cut short. Ren lay on his side and tried not to listen for his own name. In the first months, he still flinched at every jangle of keys, every pause outside his door. Later, he learned that nobody came for him unless it was written in the schedule. Rumors, however, moved through concrete better than light. One afternoon, while they waited in line for the infirmary, someone at the back whispered about a new resocialization project. Certain inmates, the calm ones without violence on their record, would be moved out of the block. No more shared cells, no more nightly flashlight checks. Instead, house arrest under the supervision of senior officers. On paper, it sounded almost kind, a second chance wrapped in bureaucracy. In reality, everyone understood what it meant. Whoever you were assigned to would become your whole world. Their habits, their temper, their moods would decide how breathable your days were. A few Omegas in the line snorted quietly. Someone muttered, "You only move from one leash to another." Someone else said under his breath, "Better a room than this." Ren listened, arms crossed, shoulders hunched against the corridor chill. The phrase "second chance" slid past him like water over stone. He had stopped counting himself among people who were chosen for experiments that might end well. The system had already made it clear that his role was to be convenient, not redeemed. The idea that anyone in an office far away would look at his file and decide he was worth trusting outside a cell felt almost absurd. That night, staring at the familiar pattern of bricks in the dim light, he caught himself doing what he hated most, imagining. imagining a door that opened not onto the same gray corridor, but into a space with another kind of silence, imagining a ceiling without peeling paint, air without the chemical tang of disinfectant, a bed that did not scream every time he turned over. He exhaled sharply, as if trying to push the thought away. "Not for you," he whispered, half curse, half prayer. The wall did not answer. It never did. It simply stood there, solid and indifferent, like the system that had already decided he did not deserve anyone's belief, least of all in his innocence. The day they called him to the administrative wing began as every other. The lights snapped on before dawn, too bright for eyes that had barely closed. A voice in the corridor barked the same order he had heard for years, and bodies moved in a practiced sequence. Sit up, feet to the floor, wait for the slot in the door to open. Roll call was short and mechanical. Names rattled off like inventory, not like people. Wren answered when his was spoken, voice rough from sleep and recycled air. Breakfast tasted of nothing. Lukewarm porridge, bread that crumbled to dust on the tongue, water that smelled faintly of metal. The medic appeared right after, pushing a cart that rattled with plastic cups and blister packs. Suppressants dropped into his palm, familiar shapes against skin that had stopped hoping for a day without them. He swallowed obediently, feeling the tablets scratch their way down his throat, and wondered for a fleeting second who he might be without this chemical leash. The thought was useless, so he let it go. He expected the door to close and the day to collapse into its usual blocks of waiting. Instead, the lock turned again out of sequence. The same guard who had handed out breakfast opened the door wider and jerked his head. "Harper. With me." It was not the usual tone for a trip to the infirmary or the showers. Something in it made Wren's shoulders tighten. He stepped into the corridor, the cuffs cool against his wrists, and felt the familiar tunnel of concrete at his back, like a mouth that could close at any moment. The route they took was wrong. Not toward the medical block, not toward the exercise yard. They turned left, then left again, into hallways he had only glimpsed from a distance. The walls here were painted a lighter color, not the dull institutional gray of the cell block. The floor was cleaner. The air smelled different too, less of sweat and disinfectant, more of toner, coffee, and stale paper. The sounds changed. Fewer shouts, more muffled voices, the whir of printers, the clack of keyboards. He felt exposed in this part of the building, like a stain carried into a white room. Staff in shirts and badges glanced up as he passed, then quickly away, the way people look at a file they do not want to take home. The guard stopped at a shut door with frosted glass, knocked once, and pushed it open without waiting for an answer. Inside were two people. One was a woman in a neat suit, hair pinned back, a tablet resting flat on the desk in front of her. The other wore the dark uniform of senior security, broad shoulders filling the chair even though he sat with a straight, controlled posture. Wren had heard his name whispered in the block long before he saw him. Callum Reed. An alpha with a reputation for being hard but not crooked, the kind of man who did not look away when colleagues crossed lines and did not forgive those he believed truly dangerous. For Omegas, that name carried a particular weight. He was the officer who had shut down a fight in the shower block so fast that 3 sentences from his mouth had done more than any baton. He was also the one who had signed off on punishment reports without softening them. A man you wanted far away from your throat. The woman spoke first, in a voice that sounded as if it had rehearsed a speech many times. "Wren Harper, you have been selected for review under the Pilot House Arrest Program." He stood between them, hands cuffed, feeling the weight of their attention like 2 different kinds of light. Callum did not interrupt. He held a folder in his hands, thumb resting in the crease, eyes drifting between the printed pages and the Omega in front of him. There was no hostility in that gaze, no pity either, just a precise measuring, as if he were assessing infrastructure for stress points. The curator listed criteria in a rhythm that had nothing to do with his heartbeat. Behavior over the past months rated satisfactory. No recorded incidents of physical violence, low calculated risk of escape. Suitable candidate for supervised release to a controlled private residence under officer oversight. The words stacked on each other until they stopped sounding like they were about him at all. House arrest. The phrase should have felt softer than prison. It did not. It sounded like moving the bars inside someone's life instead of outside it. He listened while she described the terms. He would live in a residence designated by the department under the constant legal authority of a senior officer. He would wear a tracking bracelet at all times. He would follow a strict schedule, submit to unannounced checks, and report his activities in daily logs. Any breach would mean immediate revocation and return to the facility. "Do you understand the conditions?" the woman asked. Wren's throat felt dry. "Yes," he said, because there was no other safe word. Callum flipped a page. Wren saw, upside down, the outline of charges he knew too well: embezzlement, attempted escape, breach of probation. Underneath, the risk assessment scores, neat and cold. Callum's finger tapped once beside the line that marked him as low risk. Then the finger moved on. Somewhere in the middle of the explanation, another section came up, almost casually. Medical monitoring. Any change in hormonal status, any sign of instability in an omega on the program had to be reported immediately. That included heat cycles, adverse reactions to medication, and pregnancy. The word landed between them like a dropped weight. Wren's gaze flicked to that line and back again, too fast for most people to notice. His stomach, already uneasy for weeks, twisted. Morning nausea, the faint metallic taste that would not leave his mouth, cycles that had blurred into each other under the suppressants. He had told himself it was stress, side effects, the body complaining in the only way it could. The idea that it might be something else had hovered at the edge of his thoughts like a shadow he refused to name. He looked away deliberately, eyes tracing the corner of the desk, the mug with a coffee ring, the scratch at the edge of Callum's badge. His jaw tightened. If he let the thought settle now, it would show on his face, in his scent, in the tension of his shoulders. This room was the last place that could happen. They slid the consent forms toward him. Pages of dense print, clauses about liability, supervision, revocation, tracking, and compliance. The pen felt strangely heavy between his fingers, as if it knew the cost of the line it was about to draw. He read enough to understand the bare bones. If he agreed, the cell would no longer be his world. In its place, there would be a house that was not his, under the authority of a man he had never spoken to before today. His hand trembled once, a small shiver that ran through the pen to the paper. The curator saw it and misread it. "Nerves are normal," she said briskly. "This is an opportunity, Mr. Harper." Opportunity. The word tasted like dust. He thought of the last time someone had used it in his hearing, right before he signed a confession that was supposed to shorten his sentence and had done the opposite. His chest tightened. For a heartbeat he considered saying no, refusing, clinging to the one constant he knew, the routine of the block, the known rhythm of suffering. Then he heard from somewhere deep inside the building the distant clang of a door and a voice shouting an order. The sound snapped back through him like a whip crack. Staying meant more of that, for however long the system decided his years should stretch, leaving at least changed the shape of the cage. He put the pen to the paper and wrote his name, once, again and again, where the markers indicated. Wren Harper. Wren Harper. Wren Harper. By the time he finished, the signature looked less like a name and more like a mark that could belong to anyone. Callum took the forms last. He checked each page with the same careful attention he had given the file, then signed his own name underneath. With that gesture, he accepted legal responsibility. The omega in front of him would no longer be just a number in a block. He would be assigned to Officer Reed's custody, his daily existence tied to the choices of that one alpha. As the guard unclipped the cuffs to swap them for a transport restraint, Wren felt the shift in his chest. The weight of the institution did not disappear. It simply moved, settling into a narrower line that ran from his wrists to the man behind the desk. "From today, you answer to me," Callum said quietly, not as a threat, not as a comfort, just as a fact. The words lodged deep. They followed Wren out of the office, down the brighter corridors, past doors he might never see again. When the outer gate of the facility finally came into view through layered fencing, he squinted against a slice of real daylight. A vehicle waited with its engine idling, ready to carry him from one kind of confinement to another. He paused for a fraction of a second before stepping up into the van. Somewhere behind him, the block he knew kept breathing in concrete and metal. Somewhere ahead, a house he had never seen stood waiting, already reshaped in the system as his new perimeter. He drew a slow, careful breath as if testing air that did not yet belong to him, and crossed the line anyway. Callum's house turned out to be neither a city apartment nor a rich man's villa. It sat low and solid on the edge of town, where the last houses gave way to a fringe of trees, and beyond them a strip of highway. From the road it probably looked unremarkable, just another brick rectangle with a small yard. Up close, Wren saw the details that mattered: the reinforced door, the discreet camera above the frame, the simple but sturdy bars on the ground floor windows. It was the kind of place built by someone who never fully trusted the world to stay outside. The van rolled through a short driveway and stopped. When the door opened, the first thing he noticed was the air. It did not smell of bleach and bodies. It smelled of cold earth, exhaust from distant trucks, and faintly, coffee. His ankles felt strange when he stepped down. The ground did not vibrate the way the concrete yard in the facility did. The sky here was open, not sliced by fences and wire, but the habit of watching where he put his feet stayed with him. Inside, the house was clean and spare. The hallway floor was worn in a straight line from door to stairs, the paint on the walls a faded neutral that did its job without style. Hooks held a small collection of jackets, arranged in practical order, not for show. A pair of boots stood neatly by the door, well used but polished. Wren's attention snagged on that detail. In the block, nobody cared what their shoes looked like as long as they stayed on. Callum took his cuffs off in the hallway and replaced them with a brief touch to the black band already fastened around his wrist. The bracelet woke, its tiny indicator light pulsing once, then settling into a steady glow. A soft chime came from somewhere deeper in the house. The system had registered that its new charge had arrived. "Upstairs," Callum said, and led the way. The stairs creaked in predictable spots, the kind of sound that came from years of the same weight on the same steps. On the second floor, the hallway opened into 3 doors. One was shut. One stood half open, showing a glimpse of a bed with an unmade dark blanket. The third Callum pushed fully open. "This is yours." The room was small but not cramped. A single bed sat against one wall, the mattress firm, the sheets pale and plain. A wardrobe with 2 doors waited empty. A narrow desk stood under a window that looked out over the backyard and the line of trees beyond it. On the opposite wall, a compact monitoring unit blinked to life. A translucent display floated above it, showing simple data readouts, signal strength from the bracelet, heart rate, timestamps for movements in and out of the room. There was no personal clutter, no photographs, no trinkets, nothing to suggest that anyone had lived here before him. Wren found that both relieving and unsettling. It meant he was not sleeping in the ghost of someone else's life. It also meant the room could easily be stripped back to nothing if he disappeared from it. Callum stayed near the door while he explained the rules. His voice stayed even, the same tone he had used in the office, as if he were reading out a manual, not setting the limits of another man's world. Wake up at a fixed hour every morning. Lights out at a fixed hour every night. No leaving the house without explicit permission and supervision. The kitchen could be used, but only after they agreed on times, and only for simple tasks. No visitors, no calls except through approved channels. Daily reports on mood, sleep, and any physical issues entered into a small console on the desk. "Door stays locked at night," Callum added. "From the outside. It is not personal. It is procedure." Wren felt the words settle like extra bolts on the door frame. He nodded once. He had heard worse. He had lived worse. But part of him still flinched at the phrase, "not personal." In his experience, nothing ever stayed impersonal for long when an Omega's body was part of the equation. The harshness in the rules came with a kind of precision. Callum did not crowd him, did not step into the room farther than he had to. He laid out the boundaries as if mapping a perimeter on a chart. This is yours. This is mine. This is shared. The roles were clear. Officer and subject, watcher and watched. Between them, the hallway and the staircase drew a physical line. Left alone, Wren placed his thin bag on the bed and opened it. A few folded clothes, toiletries in a transparent pouch, a worn paperback that had somehow followed him from intake to the block, and now here. The walls watched silently as he stacked his life in the wardrobe. The monitoring screen reflected his movements in numerical form with mild interest. His pulse rose slightly, then steadied. From the window, the backyard looked ordinary. A patch of grass, a strip of paving, a fence at the back where ivy had begun to climb. Beyond that, the first row of trees, dark and dense. Wren watched a truck pass by on the distant road, its engine a low rumble. The sound was muffled by the house, but it reminded him that there was a world moving past his perimeter, people who chose where to drive and when. He turned away. The room did not change because he looked at it. The bed remained neatly made, waiting for his weight. The door remained open for the moment, but the lock below it was solid. Freedom, he thought, came in shapes he would not have recognized a few years ago. Later, when he ventured downstairs, the rest of the house unfolded in the same restrained style. The living room held a couch with straight lines, a low table with no scratches, and a shelf of books that had actually been read, their spines softened, pages marked with thin slips of paper. On the kitchen table, a thick novel lay open face down, a mug beside it with a ring of dried coffee at the bottom. There were 2 chairs, not one. The kitchen itself looked almost domestic. Pans hung in order. There was food in the fridge that had more variety than anything he had seen in years, vegetables still smelling of soil, eggs in a carton, packets with labels he had not read since before sentencing. In the corner stood a small waste bin with a foot pedal and a clean liner. The sight of a simple functioning trash can made something twist unexpectedly in his chest. In the block, overflowing bins were just part of the landscape. In the bathroom, there were razors, shaving cream, a towel hanging square, and a stocked first aid cabinet. Pills, ointments, bandages, labeled and within expiry dates. That, more than the bars on the windows, told him this was not an ordinary home. It was a place where emergencies were anticipated and arranged for. Callum moved through these rooms with an ease that spoke of long habit. He did not ask Wren personal questions. He did not comment on his status or body. He only showed him where things were, where he could and could not go, how to use the small console in the hallway to acknowledge check-ins. Then he stepped back, as if to indicate that within these marked boundaries, the Omega could breathe without immediate interference. For Wren, used to eyes that lingered too long and hands that claimed space without asking, that professional distance felt unreal. It made him hyper-aware of his own presence. He found himself walking softer, speaking only when necessary, shrinking his movements to take up less room. He had always been told that Omegas were the weak link in any system. Here, for the first time, someone treated him not as a weakness, but as a responsibility. Night changed the house again. The sky outside the window darkened, the far highway turned into a pulse of distant lights. Inside, the sounds were different from the block. No bars clanged, no voices bounced off stone in angry echoes. Instead, he heard the muted rhythm of water hitting tile when the shower ran, the creak of the stair under a familiar weight, the faint rustle of pages turning in the living room below. Lying on his new bed, Wren stared at the ceiling. The plaster above him was cracked in one place, a thin line stretching toward the corner. His body, having lived for so long with constant noise, did not know what to do with this softer silence. Every small sound was magnified, the shift of the house settling, the sigh of wind against the window, the occasional heavy step as Callum moved from one room to another. He turned his wrist, watching the bracelet's tiny light blink. Each pulse meant the system knew exactly where he was. If he crossed a threshold without permission, alarms would trip in offices miles away. The bars here were invisible, but they were there all the same. This is still a cage, he thought, the words forming without bitterness, just clarity. Yet there were cracks in that cage. A door that could open without a siren, a window that looked out on trees instead of concrete walls. A man downstairs who could have treated him as a number and so far chose not to. Wren pulled the thin blanket up to his chest and closed his eyes. The house did not feel like home. It did not feel safe. Not yet. It felt like a suspended space between the life he had lost and something unnamed that might never come. A house that still carried the weight of a prison, but also, faintly, the outline of something else he did not dare to hope for. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the steady, distant rhythm of a book page turning downstairs, and tried to decide whether that sound made the walls feel closer or a fraction further away. Weeks slid past and rearranged themselves into a new kind of schedule. At first, every hour in Callum's house had felt like a borrowed piece of time, fragile and temporary. Slowly, the pattern hardened. Morning meant the faint clink of a mug in the kitchen below, the smell of tea and toast drifting up the stairs. By the time Wren came down, there was always a cup waiting on the table, still warm. No comment, no note, just a small, repeated fact. Once a week they drove to the supervision center together. Callum at the wheel, eyes on the road, one hand resting loose but ready. Wren in the passenger seat tracking the familiar route in silence. The navigation unit spoke every so often, naming streets and exits, a neutral voice cutting through the quiet. At the center, he signed his name on an electronic pad, let a clerk scan his bracelet, answered the same set of questions about infractions with the same word each time. No, the routine on paper was simple. Check-ins, daily logs, lights out. It wrapped around him like a second set of walls. But inside that curve, something did not fit. It began with the mornings. At first he thought it was just the change in diet. Real food, not institutional trays, woke up parts of his system that had been dormant. But the nausea came too often. Some days it waited until he drank the last mouthful of tea and then rose sharply, sending him scrambling to the bathroom. Other days it arrived before he even sat up, a rolling wave that bent him over the sink, palms pressed hard to porcelain, breath coming in short, angry gasps. Breathe, he told himself between the dry heaves. Just breathe. There were smells that had never bothered him before. The sharpness of coffee grounds when Callum opened the tin, the clean sting of dish soap, even the faint, otherwise pleasant scent of pine cleaner in the hallway could turn on him without warning, twisting his stomach until he had to lean against the wall and close his eyes. Fatigue settled into his bones like damp. On days when he barely left the house, when all he did was go from bed to kitchen to desk, he still felt as if he had been dragged through a 12-hour shift. Climbing the stairs made his thighs ache. Sitting too long made his back throb. He fell asleep faster at night, not because he was at peace, but because his body simply shut down. He logged some of it in his reports. Headache, mild nausea, tiredness, harmless words. The same ones he had used in the block whenever medications hit too hard. His fingers hovered over the input screen when he thought about adding more, about describing how different this felt. Then he erased the extra lines. Too much detail invited attention. Attention from the system had never been good for him. In his head, he kept returning to the pills. Years of cheap suppressants, dosed according to budget, not according to body weight. Years of sudden stops and starts whenever the facility's supply chain faltered. It made sense, he told himself, that his endocrine system would push back, that it would protest in waves of sickness and exhaustion. He clung to that explanation until one evening broke it. The day had been long in a way that had nothing to do with hours. The inspection from the center had gone as scheduled. No alarms, no raised voices. On paper, everything had been perfect. Back at the house, the quiet felt heavier than usual, as if the walls were holding their breath. Callum stayed downstairs with his paperwork. Wren retreated to his room and lay on his back, staring at the familiar crack in the ceiling. His thoughts drifted in circles. The block, the courtroom, the moment the judge had slammed down the sentence with a bored expression. The feeling of his own signature under his hand, over and over again. He tried, as he always did, not to think about the last week before he was moved, the week when the medication cart had passed by his cell twice without stopping, the week when the night rounds had felt wrong. His right hand moved without permission. It slid down from his chest over the thin fabric of his shirt and rested on his lower abdomen. He told himself he was just grounding himself, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing. His palm lay flat, fingers spread, pressing lightly. Something answered from beneath. It was small, at first so subtle he almost wrote it off as a muscle twitch. Then it came again. A gentle push from inside, not sharp, not painful, but undeniably there. Slow, exploratory, like a knuckle knocking once on the other side of a wall. Wren froze. The air left his lungs in a silent exhale. His hand stayed where it was, too afraid to move in case he imagined it, too afraid to pull away in case he had not. Again. A shuffle, a shift, the faintest roll under his skin, not a cramp, not a random spasm, a pattern. No, he whispered into the empty room. the word breaking halfway. Memory did what it always did when faced with something that could not be ignored. It snapped open, too bright, too loud, the fluorescent glare of the cell block corridor, the way the medic had mumbled something about a delayed shipment and moved on without leaving pills. The footsteps at strange hours, stopping outside his door when they should have passed. The silhouette filling the narrow frame, a shadow with a badge that never stepped fully into the light. He remembered the smell first. The heavy overlay of alpha scent pushed over the institutional cleanser, invasive and wrong. He remembered his own voice, thin and strained, saying "no" in a tone that sounded more like a plea than a command. After that, the images blurred, cut into fragments his mind refused to line up, the weight of another body, the burn of restraint, the roaring in his ears that drowned out everything else. Later, he had woken on the same narrow bed, bruises already forming like ink stains under his skin. No one had asked why he moved slower for days. No one had noticed the way he flinched from the medic's touch when the pills finally came back. The incident never made it into any of the reports he sometimes caught glimpses of on clipboards. Officially, nothing had happened. His hand pressed harder against his abdomen now, as if he could push time back, as if he could force the small presence to retreat into nothing. Panic rose in his chest, cold and hot at once, clawing up his throat. The logic unfolded brutally fast. A pregnant Omega under sentence was a complication. A pregnancy begun inside the facility was a scandal. Someone would have to answer for it. The easiest solution, the one systems always chose, was to erase the complication and close ranks around the damage. He saw, with terrifying clarity, the possible paths. They found out. They called it a risk factor. They transferred him to a medical unit where decisions were made without asking him. They framed it as necessary, as a way to protect him, to prevent legal trouble. Or they labeled him a liar, accused him of concealing an existing pregnancy to manipulate his conditions, and punished him for that instead. Either way, the small life he felt under his hand would be treated as evidence, not as a person. His ribs ached with the effort of breathing slowly. He pushed himself upright, back to the wall, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around his middle. The room seemed to tilt. Every sound from the house sharpened, a chair scraping downstairs, the refrigerator humming, the bracelet at his wrist ticking time in silence. In his world, a child was never just a child, not for someone like him. It was leverage, liability, and excuse. This one was something more complicated. It was a crack in the concrete shell of the system, proof that control was not as tight as the reports claimed, and when institutions saw cracks, they sealed them, not gently. He stayed like that a long time, palms pressed over his belly as if he could shield what lay inside from eyes that did not yet know to look. His mind ran in circles, hitting the same hard edges. If they knew, they would act. If they acted, it would be on their terms, not his. Somewhere inside, beneath the terror, a quieter thought tried to form. Someone should have believed him when he said no. Now, the only thing the system would believe was its own paperwork. The life shifting beneath his hand was not in any file. Not yet. The only chance it had to stay more than a line in a report was if he kept it that way for as long as he could. Hiding the changes did not work for long. Routine wrapped itself around Ren, but his body kept slipping out of its grip. His cheeks hollowed, skin going pale in a way that no amount of sleep could fix. Clothes that once hung straight began to sit differently around his waist, fabric pulling when he buttoned it, shirts clinging where they had been loose. Callum noticed. Of course he did. Men who lasted in his position learned to read small shifts, a slower step, a hesitation on the stairs, the way someone stood up from a chair. At first, he let those observations sit at the edge of his mind. The program manual encouraged a degree of autonomy. The Omega needed space to adjust. So he pretended not to register the extra seconds Ren spent in the bathroom, the way the younger man pushed food around his plate more than he ate it. The morning that broke that pattern started with silence. The kitchen clock ticked past the usual time when Ren came down the stairs. Steam from the kettle curled in the air and faded. Callum poured tea into 2 mugs as he always did, waited, then frowned. On the hallway monitor, the small dot that represented Ren's bracelet glowed steady and unmoving in the same room for too long. He stood there for a moment, listening. No footsteps on the stairs, no sound of a door, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant rush of traffic from the highway. Then he went up. The bathroom door on the second floor was half closed. When he pushed it open, the sharp, clean smell of disinfectant mixed with something sour hung in the air. Wren sat on the tiled floor, back against the side of the tub, knees drawn up so tight his arms could barely fit around them. His head was bent, breath shallow, face damp with sweat. The toilet bowl beside him told its own story. For a second, Wren flinched, instinct making him try to pull himself together, to force his body into some semblance of control. His fingers slipped on the cool porcelain, and he had to shut his eyes against another wave of dizziness. No jokes today, Callum thought, and the phrase felt wrong even inside his own head. He did not ask the easy question, the one officers threw around when they wanted someone to admit weakness. "What is wrong with you?" Instead, he crouched beside him, boots squeaking faintly on the wet tile, and offered an arm. His hand was firm when he helped Wren to his feet, but not rough. The Omega's legs shook under his weight. Callum guided him to the edge of the tub, made sure he was steady, then reached past him to turn on the cold tap in the sink. "Rinse," he said quietly, placing a glass in Wren's hand. Water washed away the acid taste, but not the heaviness in his chest. His body wanted to sag, to slide back down to the floor. Callum waited, not crowding him, watching the color in his face shift from gray to something closer to human. When Wren's breathing finally slowed, Callum spoke again. "We are calling a doctor." Wren started to protest automatically. "I am fine," he rasped, the words thin and unconvincing even to his own ears. Callum's expression did not change. "You are not." There was no impatience in his voice, only a flat statement. He did not reach for the facility list. Instead, he pulled out his personal phone, scrolled to a contact pinned near the top, and stepped just outside the doorway to make the call. Wren could hear only fragments: a name, a low explanation, the address. The doctor arrived with the quiet efficiency of someone used to dealing with officers, not inmates. Middle-aged, compact, with eyes that missed nothing. He wore no uniform, just a plain shirt and a professional neutrality that wrapped around him like a second skin. His bag clicked open on the bedroom chair, instruments laid out with practiced hands. Wren sat on the edge of his bed, fingers twisting the hem of his shirt. The monitoring screen on the wall threw out numbers he tried not to look at. Callum stood back near the door, close enough to step in if needed, far enough to give the illusion of privacy. The examination was thorough but restrained. Blood pressure cuff, stethoscope, questions about appetite, sleep, medication history. Wren answered in short phrases, voice catching whenever the questions brushed too close to the cell block. When the doctor's hand rested gently, professionally on his abdomen, feeling for what lay beneath, time seemed to slow. Wren stared at a knot in the wooden floor, counting his breaths until the fingers paused, pressed again, then withdrew. The diagnosis was not spoken like a surprise. It came out in a calm tone, as if confirming something he had already written in his notebook. "You are pregnant." The word hung in the air, heavy and final. Wren's throat closed around any answer. He focused on keeping his facial muscles still, on not shaking his head, on not curling in protectively around himself in a way that would prove the doctor right more than any test result. The doctor went on, outlining term estimates, likely conception window. The dates lined up with the last weeks in the facility with cruel precision. Wren did not need to see Callum's face to know that he was doing the same arithmetic. Notes were made in a file, a physical one, not yet in the electronic system. The doctor's pen moved quickly, but when he reached the box marked reporting, he hesitated. His gaze lifted, not to Wren, but to Callum. They both knew what the protocol demanded. Any pregnancy in a supervised Omega on a state program had to be reported to Central within hours. The chain of events after that was automatic: medical transfer, investigation, administrative discipline. No space in the flowchart for what the Omega wanted. No space for how it had happened. When the door closed behind the doctor, the house felt smaller. They were alone again, but not as they had been before. Between them now lay the unspoken weight of that file and the decision that had not yet been made about where it would go. Wren expected the blowback. He braced for the anger he had seen in other officers when their records were threatened, when something slipped outside their control. He waited for the sharp, cold question he had heard more times than he could count. Why did you hide this? Callum did not ask it. Instead, he studied him in a long, quiet look that felt nothing like the assessments in the office weeks before. Back then he'd been measuring risk. Now he was staring at the aftermath of a system he had served for years. What happened? He asked, the words simple and unbearably direct. Before the transfer, the distance between them closed by a fraction. Wren's mouth went dry. The story sat like broken glass in his throat. He managed only pieces at first, pills that did not arrive on schedule, night rounds that lasted too long outside his door, a shadow that stepped inside without writing its name, hands that held him down when he said no. He did not have dates or badge numbers or clear faces. Trauma had smudged the edges. What it had not erased was the smell of that night, the threat in it, the way fear had sunk into his bones and never entirely left. His voice shook, stopped, started again. At one point he pressed his palms against his thighs so hard they ached just to keep from folding in on himself. He felt exposed, like he was back in the block under fluorescent lights, except there was no clipboard this time, no bored officer pretending to listen. When he finished, there was a long pause. Callum's jaw was tight, a muscle ticking once near his ear. The anger in his eyes was not the wild kind that led to raised fists. It was something colder, simmering under control. It was not aimed at Wren. He could have poked holes in the account. He could have asked for details Wren could not provide, names he could not give, times stamped neatly on a schedule. He could have chosen the path of least resistance and filed the report exactly as the rules demanded, letting the system grind over them both. He did none of that. Understood, he said quietly. 2 syllables, but they hit with more force than an entire speech. In them was an admission that he accepted this version of events, that he recognized the pregnancy as a consequence of violence and not manipulation. He did not ask for proof. He did not suggest that maybe Wren had brought this on himself. For the first time since the trial, someone in authority took his word as enough. In a world where every form, every log, every line of code in the tracking system treated omegas like problems to be managed, that simple act of belief was radical. It bent something in the air between them, shifting their positions from opposite sides of a report to the same side of a problem. Outside, a truck rolled past on the highway, its low rumble barely reaching the house. Inside, a different kind of machinery began to move, not the automated gears of the institution, but the slow, conscious choice of one man deciding to look deeper than the paper in front of him. In the days that followed, the house filled with a silence that did not match its walls. Outwardly, nothing had changed. The bracelet on Wren's wrist continued to blink in its steady rhythm, feeding location data to the same servers as before. The daily logs still went through. The weekly status reports still reached the program curator, full of familiar phrases about compliance and stability. But under those layers of routine sat a single missing line. The doctor's report, the one that should have carried the word pregnant into the central database, had not been sent. It existed only on paper, in a folder that traveled once from the doctor's bag to Callum's hands and then to the locked drawer of his desk. The physician, bound to the system by contracts and to Callum by older debts, delayed entering the data with the thinnest of justifications. Lab verification, additional observation, technical backlog. It could not last forever. In a structure built on records, gaps eventually drew attention. Callum spent his evenings at the kitchen table with regulations spread out in front of him. The lamp above threw a tight circle of light over the pages. In that circle lay the official skeleton of the world he had served for most of his adult life. He knew the protocols by heart, but now he read them as if they belonged to someone else. Any confirmed pregnancy in an omega under custodial supervision triggered an automatic chain. Internal review. Shift audits in the facility where conception was likely, questioning of staff on duty, transfer of the omega to a specialized medical block, the language of care wrapped around the core intent, identify weak points, close them, assign blame. An omega carrying a child conceived under unclear circumstances was not seen as a victim. He was a potential liability, a possible source of legal exposure, scandal, leverage. The unborn child was not a person in those lines of text. It was a risk factor. On the surface, there were options that did not sound monstrous if spoken quickly enough. Report the pregnancy immediately. Present it as unfortunate but manageable. Trust the system to make room for a controlled birth, to ensure the Omega was safe, to assume that someone might even be disciplined for what had been done to him. Callum's experience stripped away that thin coat of optimism. He had watched too many inquiries from the inside. When statistics and reputation were at stake, decisions came fast and clean. Files were edited, testimonies were shaped, outcomes were chosen not based on what was right, but on what could be defended on paper. He could imagine the conversations already. Senior officers around a conference table, voices low, words like damage control and precedent and liability. A quiet suggestion that terminating the pregnancy would simplify everything, protect the institution, spare the Omega the burden, make sure nobody could ever prove anything. The faces he put around that table were not cruel caricatures. They were people he knew, people who had laughed with him in break rooms and signed forms next to his, people who had shrugged when an Omega's complaint went nowhere, people who would never say out loud that some lives were easier to erase than to protect, but whose signatures would sit under the decisions that did exactly that. Upstairs, under an old cotton t-shirt, Wren's body told its own story. The swell at his waist was still small enough to hide under loose clothes, but not small enough to ignore. When he caught his reflection sideways, a tightness gripped his lungs. The mirror did not show bruises this time. It showed proof. His hands went to his stomach more often now, sometimes in fear, sometimes in something rawer and more complicated. The movements inside were no longer rare. They came at odd hours, during the soft rumble of a passing truck, when he leaned over the sink to wash a cup, when he closed his eyes at night and the house creaked around him. Small kicks, rolls, a restless shifting as if the life inside him refused to lie still. Every time it happened, a part of him flared in response. Anger, yes, at the way his body had been used again as a battleground for other people's choices, but also a fierce, stubborn impulse he had not expected to feel. Fight, he thought once, fingers pressing lightly over the spot where the latest kick had landed. You do not belong to them. His t-shirt, stretched a little over the curve, was a constant reminder that his body was once again being read by rules he had not written. On an ordinary street, a stranger might have seen a pregnant Omega and thought of families, of futures. In the eyes of the system that had his name in its files, his condition was closer to an offense. Pregnancy, for someone in his position, was not a private event. It was a breach, an anomaly in a tightly controlled environment, a sign that protocols had failed. In a quiet, brutal way, his body had committed a crime against the narrative of absolute control. Callum understood that with the same clarity that made him good at his job. Each day he let pass without updating the central record brought them closer to a line. Once the pregnancy hit the system, every choice would be taken out of their hands. Committees would decide, regulations would dictate, lawyers would advise. In none of those steps would Wren's voice be the one that mattered most. At the same time, each small alteration he made to the paperwork, each omission, each delayed entry, pushed him further out of the role he had worn for years. An officer falsifying reports was not a gray area. It was a violation. He knew what happened to colleagues who were caught adjusting timestamps or overlooking contraband. Investigations ate them alive, not because the institution was morally outraged, but because it had to preserve the illusion of purity. He had built his reputation on the idea that he was not for sale, that he did not bend rules for personal gain. There was bitter irony in the fact that the first rule he was considering breaking was not to protect himself, but to protect someone the system considered disposable. In the evenings, Wren watched him from the doorway sometimes, papers spread out, brows drawn, pen tapping once, twice, before moving to cross out a line or underline a clause. The lamplight picked out new grooves in his face that had not been there when they had first met. Responsibility, Wren realized, was carving itself into him. For Wren, the question was not abstract. It lived in every cramped breath, every trip to the bathroom, every cautious step down the stairs. Would the child inside him be allowed to be born at all? And if so, into whose hands would it land? A social worker's, a foster system's, a cold institution's, or his? In his world, children like this were often taken and turned into symbols, proof that the system cared, printed in glossy reports with phrases about rehabilitation and outreach, or proof that it had been cleansed of misconduct if they were removed quietly and never mentioned again. He could not stop picturing hands reaching for the baby that was not yet here, not to hold, but to remove. Inside the brick walls of the house, another kind of investigation was already underway. It did not involve badges or official questions. It lived in the shared glances over half-eaten meals, in the careful way Callum asked about his nausea without writing down the answer, in the moments when his gaze flickered to Wren's midsection and then away, jaw tight. They were both, in their own ways, interrogating themselves. How far are you willing to go? How much are you willing to lose? Who are you, when the rules you have lived by protect the wrong side? Outside, the house remained what it had always been to the neighborhood, a quiet place on the edge of town, owned by a solitary officer who kept to himself. No one walking past would have known that behind the reinforced door, a decision was forming that would never make it into any official protocol. A decision about whether a life that existed only under skin and in a hidden folder would be given the chance to exist in the open at all. The decision did not arrive as a dramatic sentence spoken over a table. It seeped in at the edges, changing small things first. The next set of lab results should have gone directly from the doctor's terminal to the central server in the supervision unit. Instead, Callum drove to the clinic himself. He signed for a sealed envelope, thanked the receptionist with the same professional calm as always, and walked back to his car with the weight of the papers suddenly far heavier than their pages allowed. At home, he slit the envelope open in his office, not in the kitchen. Hormone levels, blood chemistry, the quiet confirmation of advancing pregnancy, no anomalies that could be weaponized as a medical excuse. At the bottom, a blank space where an electronic signature and a digital send command should have been. He closed the folder and placed it in the bottom drawer of his desk, turning the key with a soft click. In the kitchen, the kettle boiled over. On another day, he called the doctor again, voice low. The request he made was simple on the surface. In any standard report that might be audited, note only that the Omega's hormonal balance was stable. No mention of why. No mention of gestation, of weeks, of trimesters. A bland line where a vital fact should have been. From the other end of the line came a pause, then a short assent. The physician knew how the institution worked. He also knew how many times Callum's name had appeared on commendations for shutting down abuses others ignored. Debts were not always recorded on paper. To the program curator, Callum sent polite, carefully worded messages. Wren was adapting well, he wrote. The home environment seemed to support educational work he had initiated, basic budgeting, reading, structured routines that might aid reintegration later. More unannounced visits, he suggested, could unsettle that fragile progress. For the sake of the pilot's success, inspections should be kept to a minimum for now. Behind those phrases lay a very different motive. Every canceled visit was one less pair of eyes that might catch the shape of Wren's body shifting under his clothes, one less chance for an inspector to ask for updated medical data. In the kitchen, a new kind of quiet grew between them. It was not the earlier silence, raw and stiff, where each of them stayed carefully on their side of an invisible line. This one was thicker, layered with things not said. Wren felt it when he moved more slowly around the table, when he eased himself onto a chair with one hand unconsciously supporting his lower back. He felt it when he caught Callum's gaze slide to his stomach and then jerk away, as if the officer feared that looking too long would cross some boundary neither of them knew how to name. There was no disgust there, no accusation. What Wren saw was worry, tightly folded and hidden under discipline. Worry about how long they could stay unobserved. How long they could stretch the word stable before someone questioned what it meant. The emotions in Wren doubled in opposite directions. Gratitude, sharp enough to hurt, for the fact that someone from the other side of the bars was now standing between him and the machine that had chewed through his life once already. Fear, just as sharp, that the cost of that stand would land on both of them, that he would watch a man who had chosen to help him be torn apart by the same rules he had once enforced. At night, The house split into two worlds. Upstairs, Ren lay awake, tracing the small movements under his skin with an anxious hand. Downstairs, the office light burned long after midnight. Callum sat hunched over binders that most officers never read twice. The guidelines for house arrest programs, the internal memos that clarified obligations, appendices full of footnotes written in dry legal language. He began to read them not as instructions, but as terrain. Somewhere in this landscape there had to be footholds for what he was trying to do. The phrasing that demanded that staff immediately report significant changes in a supervised Omega's condition turned out to be less absolute than it appeared. Immediately, in the thick explanatory notes, could be interpreted in light of practical constraints. When waiting for confirmatory tests, when seeking expert interpretation, when assessing whether the change was transient or persistent. A few weeks could hide behind those caveats. The requirement to conduct regular medical examinations did not spell out that every minor variation had to be entered into the central database the moment it was observed. It allowed for internal monitoring, for preliminary reviews, for clinician discretion, words that lawyers loved because they could be bent. He traced these loopholes with the tip of his pen, underlining here, circling there, building an invisible bridge between what the rules demanded and what his conscience now insisted on. When his eyes blurred from print, he switched files. Ren's old case lay on the desk like a wound that had finally been cut open properly. The arrest report. Witness statements, some nearly identical in phrasing, despite supposedly coming from different people. The plea agreement that had seemed like a good idea to some overworked public defender. Ren's confession, signed in shaky handwriting, taking responsibility for decisions that did not match the role his minor job on the periphery of the scheme suggested. The more Callum read, the clearer the pattern became. The real architects of the embezzlement had sat far above the level where anyone would dirty their hands with actual transactions. They had kept their names off everything risky. When the investigation needed a culprit, the easiest body to drop the weight on had been the Omega, with least protection and least leverage. Ren had been, in that process, not a person, but a solution. Anger sat low in Callum's stomach as he turned each page. It was not a sudden realization. He had seen this dynamic before in other files, in other lives, but this time there was a living, breathing result of it upstairs, flinching at sudden noises and carrying the consequence of a second violation. The system had taken Ren's freedom and his reputation without blinking. It had then allowed someone under its roof to take his bodily autonomy as well. The idea that the same structure might now claim the right to decide if his child would exist was, for Callum, a line too far. They did not draw plans on the table or speak in dramatic vows. Most days they barely mentioned the future. Conversations stayed close to the surface, whether Ren could manage a short walk without dizziness, which foods he could keep down when the next check-in at the center was scheduled. The deeper questions pressed against the inside of their throats and stayed there. One evening, late, the dam cracked just enough. Ren had been on his feet too long, washing dishes with more stubbornness than strength. When he finally set the last cup on the drying rack and turned, the room tilted a little. He caught the back of the chair with a hand that trembled more than he wanted to admit. Callum stepped forward, half a pace, then stopped himself, letting Ren find his balance on his own. The space between them hummed with everything unsaid. Ren lowered himself into the chair, breathing slow. His palm rested on the gentle swell of his abdomen, fingers spread as if to reassure himself that the life inside was still there, still moving of its own will. He stared at the worn surface of the table for a moment, watching the shadows shift, then lifted his head. "If I want this child," he said quietly, the words thin but steady, "he has the right to be born." It was not a plea, not a question. It was a statement of something he had never before allowed himself to claim out loud, a right. For a heartbeat, the house seemed to hold still. Callum's gaze met his, and whatever calculation usually sat behind his eyes dropped away. He did not launch into logistical arguments, did not list risks, did not tell Ren how difficult it would be. He just nodded once. It was a small gesture, barely more than a dip of the head. But in that nod, both of them heard what it meant. Callum was aligning himself not with the flowchart in the manual, but with the thin, fragile line of Wren's choice. He was agreeing, without flourish, to act as if that right were real, even in a world that would not recognize it. The conspiracy they had been building in careful, practical steps between the kitchen and the office finally had a heart. It did not need a name, or an oath, or a plan carved in stone. It needed only two people who understood that from that moment on, every report they filed and every detail they hid was part of the same quiet rebellion, keeping one small, stubborn life from being erased into a footnote. The first real test of their choice did not come with sirens or a knock at the door. It came in the shape of a date on a calendar and an automated reminder in Callum's inbox. Every few months, the central office demanded an extended status report on each person in the house arrest program. It was meant to be a wide lens: behavior, health, social dynamics, any incidents worth noting. For most officers, it was a box to tick. They filled in the fields with the usual phrases, attached whatever the system pulled up automatically, and hit send without thinking. This time, Callum thought about every word. He started the report the way he always had: identification details, case number, length of sentence, conditions of release. The template marched him through each section in order. In the behavior field, he wrote that Wren's discipline remained consistently high. No curfew violations, no unauthorized communications, no attempts to tamper with the bracelet. In the section on social integration, he noted limited contacts by design. The only regular interactions were with himself and authorized medical staff. There were no visits from family or friends, no new relationships forming outside the controlled environment. To the system, isolation often looked like compliance. Then he reached the health section. The form suggested phrases of its own in faint gray text beneath the empty box. No significant changes, within expected parameters, stable under current treatment. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He typed, "Hormonal profile under control. No serious deviations observed." It looked harmless on the screen. Clinical. Boring. It said nothing and everything at once, implying that any fluctuations were within the expected range for an omega adapting to life outside of a cell. It did not mention that the body in question was working overtime to build a new life cell by cell. Behind that one line lay hours of quiet manipulation. He had already swapped out the default lab results in the system for older ones, taken before the pregnancy. The numbers for hormone levels, blood counts, and metabolic markers came from a time when Wren's body still belonged solely to himself, even if the law said otherwise. Those results sat in the database where any automated query would find them first. The more recent analyses lived in two places only: the locked drawer in his office and the doctor's private files. If anyone audited the central record superficially, they would see a neat progression of tests showing a stabilizing omega, nothing more. Where values could not be simply replaced, he adjusted them by hand. A slightly elevated marker here could be attributed to diet. A changed value there could be explained by switching medication brands. He did not invent figures out of thin air. He nudged existing ones just enough to keep them plausible. In a few cases, instead of updating a field, he attached a copy of an older report and marked it as recently reviewed. The system accepted scanned documents as readily as fresh input. No one had bothered to close that loophole because until now, no one like him had needed it. Looking at the finished report, Callum understood exactly what he had built. It was more than a lie. It was a bubble, a controlled pocket of altered reality inside a network that prided itself on total information. Inside that bubble, Wren and the child he carried existed in the flesh, but not in official truth. Every time he scrawled his name at the bottom of one of these summaries, his hand did not quite tremble, but the muscles in his forearm tightened. He had signed countless documents over the years: incident reports, disciplinary actions, commendations. Those signatures had always aligned him with the system's version of events. These new ones placed him directly against it. He knew the price of being caught. An officer falsifying records was more than a rule breaker. He was a perfect scapegoat. The institution loved public examples. A single disgraced staff member with doctored reports could be paraded as proof that the system cleansed itself. Investigators would comb through every decision he had made, retrofitting malice into places where there had only been routine. They would not only end his career, They would rewrite his story in their files the way they had rewritten Wren's, reducing years of choices to a handful of convenient labels. Upstairs, Wren watched fragments of this process in stolen glimpses. Sometimes, coming down for a glass of water at night, he would see Callum at the table, laptop open, papers spread like a fan. The officer's face in the glow of the screen looked different than it did during inspections or drives to the center. Less controlled, more tired. There were moments when his hand rested above the keyboard, motionless, jaw clenched as if he were arguing with someone only he could hear. Once, Wren saw the pen slip a fraction when Callum signed a printed sheet, leaving a tiny smear of ink at the edge of his name. It was the smallest of cracks. But for a man who had lived his life on precision and clean lines, it said more than raised voices ever could. Wren felt the weight of those shaky moments like a physical pressure between his shoulder blades. He knew too well what it meant to have your fate decided in rooms you did not enter, by people who weighed reputations against statistics and always found someone expendable. Now, his life was once again being shaped by choices made over reports. The difference was that this time those choices were being made in his favor, not against him. That knowledge was not comforting. It was terrifying. His existence had turned into a quiet gamble someone else was taking. Every falsified value, every omitted line, increased the odds that his child would make it to birth. They also increased the odds that, if the lie was ever uncovered, Callum's name would be dragged through the same mud the system had once drowned him in. The sense of debt that grew in Wren was heavy and unfamiliar. Surviving, he realized, would not be enough. He could not let this risk be for nothing. He would have to stay alive, stay sane, stay out of trouble, in a world that had never given him a reason to believe he deserved that much. When the report finally left the outbox, the reply from the curator came in as it always did. A short, automated acknowledgement. Status received. No additional questions. No flagged anomalies. On the surface, it meant nothing had changed. The program moved forward. The pilot continued. The central office remained content with its numbers and boxes. Underneath, each bland confirmation pulled them a little further away from the official version of reality, and a little closer to a place from which they could no longer plausibly climb back. There would come a point, Callum knew, when the gap between his reports and the truth would be too wide to bridge with clever footnotes. He closed the laptop, the glow shrinking to a dark rectangle. In the quiet that followed, he could hear Wren moving slowly upstairs, the faint thump of his steps, the creak of the old floor. False lines in real reports had bought them time. Nothing more. Time in which a body could grow a child, in which a former inmate could begin to imagine a future, and in which a man who had always trusted paper more than people had to keep choosing, day after day, which side of the record he stood on. Every lie eventually met a flashlight. In their case, it arrived as an email, stamped with official language and a window of time so narrow it felt like a warning rather than a courtesy. A routine inspection of the pilot house arrest program, a quality check, a compliance visit. Callum read it once, then again, the way he used to read incident reports when he suspected the truth was hiding between tidy phrases. His name had always been filed under reliable. No surprises, no deviations, no noise. That, he realized, could make him a perfect sample, or a perfect target. The morning of the visit began too clean. Callum wiped the kitchen counter twice, even though it already shone. He checked the bracelet console in the hallway, watching the signal icon pulse steady, then opened the front door and stood still, listening to the road beyond the trees. The distant highway carried its usual low rumble, indifferent to whatever was about to happen inside the brick walls. Upstairs, Wren fought his own panic with practical motions. The pregnancy had moved past the stage where it could be hidden by sheer will. Even under loose clothes, the curve of his abdomen changed how fabric fell, how he stood, how he breathed. Callum had told him to wear the widest layers he had, to stay in the kitchen where the table and chair backs could break up his outline, to keep movements slow and ordinary. Be smaller, Wren told himself, not as self-pity, but as strategy. Be forgettable. A car turned into the driveway earlier than expected. Two people stepped out, both in strict suits that looked out of place against the quiet yard. They carried tablets instead of clipboards and wore expressions that never fully warmed. Not aggressive, not overtly hostile, just the cold attention of professionals trained to find cracks without ever raising their voice. Callum met them at the door with a calm that had been built over years of inspections, audits, and internal politics. He introduced himself. They introduced themselves, names that sounded like departments rather than people. One carried a small device for scanning. The other's eyes moved constantly, cataloging entry points, camera placement, the strength of the lock, the angle of the front window bars. They started outside, a perimeter walk. The inspector with the scanner checked the bracelet signal in real time, confirming the geofence boundary, comparing it against what the central dashboard displayed. The other inspector studied the camera above the door, then the motion sensor near the side gate, as if deciding how much trust to assign each piece of hardware. Inside, they asked for logs, entry and exit records, weekly check-in confirmations. Callum handed over the folder with the same controlled timing he used in official briefings. Papers were neat. Dates were written in words, as required by some old formatting rule that made everything harder to skim. The inspectors did not seem bothered. They skimmed anyway, fast and sharp. Wren stayed in the kitchen. He sat at the table with a mug in his hands, not drinking, just holding it to give his fingers something to do. He kept his shoulders angled so the chair back hid his midsection. He kept his breathing shallow so his shirt would not shift too much. When the inspectors entered the kitchen, their presence changed the air instantly, like pressure before a storm. They asked about routine, wake time, meal schedule, bathroom access, interaction rules between officer and subject. Wren answered in short, careful sentences. He kept his gaze steady without challenging them. His voice trembled once, then steadied when he forced his throat to relax. One inspector watched his face a beat too long, then his hands, then his chest, as if listening for something he could not name. Wren felt heat creep up his neck. He lowered his eyes to the mug, willing his scent to stay neutral, willing his body not to betray him with a sudden shift or a kick from inside. Stay still, he thought. Please, just stay still. Callum redirected the focus with procedure. He offered the hallway console data, demonstrated the daily compliance check, showed the lock mechanism used at night. His movements were measured, almost boring. It was a performance of normality, built from real habits and reinforced with rehearsed calm. Then the question arrived, soft as paper and just as sharp. Medical records. The inspector asked for updated health information, phrasing it like routine. Callum did not hesitate. He retrieved a set of printed reports from his office, pages he had prepared in advance, numbers pulled from older tests, updated with small, plausible shifts. The documents looked official because they were formatted exactly like official documents. The lie wore the correct uniform. The inspectors flipped through the pages. One nodded, expression unchanged. The other paused at a line about medication history and looked up. "Any adverse reactions lately?" he asked, as if it were casual. Nausea, weakness, instability. To an outside ear, it was a standard question. To Wren, it sounded like a blade finding the gap between ribs. Callum answered with a balance so fine it felt like walking on glass. There had been mild nausea and fatigue, consistent with adjustment and past suppressant cycles. The physician had noted it, recommended hydration and dietary changes, and found no sign of serious pathology. Everything remained within expected limits. Wren heard the truth woven into the lie. He had been nauseous. He had been weak. A doctor really had seen him. The only thing missing was the word that would detonate the entire house. The inspector studied Callum for a second longer than necessary, as if trying to measure whether that calm was natural or performed. Then he looked back down and continued flipping pages. Minutes stretched. Questions came and went. Wren answered when asked, kept his hands on the mug, kept his body behind the table. The pregnancy stayed quiet, as if it understood the stakes. At last, the inspectors closed their tablets and returned to the door. No formal objections, no immediate flags. A neutral statement that the pilot site appeared compliant. They left behind the faint smell of cheap cologne and office air, a scent that did not belong in a house where the biggest danger had been silence. When the car disappeared down the driveway, the house did not immediately relax. The quiet that followed was heavier than before, full of the sound of their own breathing. Callum stood by the window for a moment, watching the road through the trees as if expecting the car to turn back. Wren stayed seated, hands still wrapped around the mug. His shoulders finally loosened, and only then did he realize how much they had been locked in place. "They almost saw," he whispered, the words barely there. Callum did not correct him. He did not reassure him with promises. He simply nodded once, jaw tight, eyes distant with calculation. They had passed this inspection, but it had not felt like victory. It had felt like a warning shot. Another visit like that, and the margins would shrink. Another question asked a little differently, another glance held a second longer, and the bubble of false lines would pop. The system had looked into their house and found nothing. This time, both of them understood what that truly meant. Not safety, not forgiveness, only time. After the inspectors left, Callum went into his office and did not turn on the light. He sat behind the desk as if the darkness could hide him from the consequences of the day. The house around him made quiet, ordinary sounds, pipes settling, the faint hum of appliances, the distant pulse of the highway. In the dark, his own breathing sounded too loud, like a confession. He replayed every moment of the visit with brutal precision. The way one inspector's eyes had paused on Wren's face, the tone of the question about nausea. The half-second of silence after Callum's answer, the moment that could have held suspicion, if they had wanted it to. He ran through his own words again and again, testing them for weakness. He could not shake the feeling that the inspection had not been random. It had been a fingertip pressed lightly against a bruise to see if the man flinched. Experience told him that central oversight rarely moved in straight lines. They did not strike immediately when they sensed something off. They waited, they watched. They let a situation develop until it produced more proof, more leverage, more clean angles for blame. When they finally acted, they did it with a file thick enough to crush anyone beneath it. If suspicion had been planted today, the next steps would be quiet at first. A follow-up request for additional medical documentation, a call to the clinic, phrased as routine, an audit of the timestamps on Callum's report submissions, a review of the bracelet data for patterns. Then, when enough threads were gathered, an internal investigation would open like a trap door. And when that happened, everyone would be a target. Callum knew how the institution framed narratives. He would become the officer who falsified documents and betrayed public trust. Wren would become the manipulative Omega who hid a pregnancy to exploit the program. The child would become the most convenient casualty, the easiest variable to remove so the system could close the file and move on. In the darkness, that truth sharpened into a single choice Callum had avoided for years by telling himself he belonged to the structure, not to individual outcomes. He could report the pregnancy now, while there was still a chance to control the story, to dress it up in the language of transparency and proper procedure. He could hand the problem back to the machine and pray that the people above him behaved with something resembling humanity, or he could take another step away from the safe path. Not a dramatic leap, a deliberate move into territory where he could no longer pretend innocence if everything collapsed. He chose the second, not because he suddenly wanted to be a rebel, and not because he thought he was untouchable. He chose it because responsibility had stopped being abstract. It was no longer a concept on a training slide, a paragraph in a policy handbook. It had a face upstairs, pale from nausea but still standing. It had a heartbeat beneath Wren's skin, small and stubborn, a life that had not yet entered the world and already stood in the system's crosshairs. He turned on the desk lamp. The light cut the office into sharp angles. He pulled Wren's case file from the locked drawer and opened it again, not to skim, but to dig. For the first time, he read the old documents with the mindset of someone preparing to fight, not to file. Arrest procedure, chain of custody, witness statements, the plea agreement, the confession that carried Wren's signature like a brand. He searched for cracks the institution had ignored because it served them better to keep the case closed. The cracks were there. A protocol for detainment that had been signed at the wrong time relative to the recorded arrest. A search procedure that had no proper independent witness listed. Statements that echoed each other too closely, as if written from a shared script. A notation about evidence handling that jumped over a required step. Small violations, the kind that courts sometimes dismissed as harmless, but which could become lethal if arranged into a pattern. Callum began to take notes, writing in tight, controlled handwriting. He did not label his work as an accusation. He framed it as concern for procedural integrity. He drafted a request for review, citing inconsistencies that could justify a reduction in sentence, a reclassification, a shift from incarceration to conditional supervision. He wrote it as if he were protecting the institution from its own mistakes, because that language had the best chance of being heard. At the same time, he prepared another track, one that looked like standard bureaucracy but was, in reality, part of the same shield, a medical status update for Wren, stable, compliant, demonstrating progress, no escalation in risk indicators, a candidate for continued supervised community placement. In that document, he reinforced the version of reality he had already built. Nothing critical had changed, no red flags, no anomalies, no reason for intensified scrutiny. Each page he printed and signed was a delayed strike against his own career. He understood that perfectly. If an investigator ever laid these documents side by side with the truth, they would see the careful curve of deception. Not sloppy, not impulsive, intentional, the kind the system punished hardest. There was a moment, as he fed the last page into the printer, when his hand paused. He imagined himself in a sterile interview room, badge stripped, uniform replaced by civilian clothes, his name spoken with disappointment and disgust. He imagined the headlines inside the institution: officer compromised, program integrity threatened. He imagined how easily his years of service could be rewritten as the prelude to one disgrace. Then another image slid in, uninvited. Wren asleep upstairs, not curled in fear, not shaking with panic, simply sleeping. The way his shoulders lowered when the house was quiet. The way he had said, in a voice that barely carried, that the child had the right to be born. Callum felt something he did not expect, not triumph, not pride, but a strange, hard relief. The relief of finally choosing a side that made sense to him as a person, not as an employee. He worked late into the night, building the paperwork that might buy them time, might shift the legal ground under Wren's feet, might make it harder for Central to yank him back into a facility where the pregnancy could be handled behind closed doors. When he finally turned off the lamp, the office fell back into darkness. He sat for a moment longer, listening again to his breathing, but it no longer sounded like a confession alone. It sounded like resolve. Upstairs, Wren's bracelet sent its steady signal into the system, declaring compliance, declaring normality. Beneath that signal, unseen by any database, a life continued to grow. Callum knew he had crossed a line. He might never be able to step back onto the path of the ideal officer. He might lose everything that had once defined him, yet, for the first time in years, that loss felt less frightening than the idea of doing nothing. The Commission's decision did not come quickly. It came the way the system always delivered outcomes, after long silence, after waiting had worn nerves down into raw edges, after life had been forced to keep moving under the weight of uncertainty. Weeks stretched into a narrow corridor of routine. Callum kept the schedule tight, because structure was the safest disguise. Wren kept filling out his daily logs with careful, bland language: sleep adequate, appetite variable, mood stable, no incidents, no breaches. The bracelet continued to pulse on his wrist, declaring compliance in quiet, regular beats. Meanwhile, Wren's body refused to remain bland. The child inside him grew more active, less shy about claiming space. What had started as soft, cautious movements became stronger shifts, small kicks that landed with surprising force. Sometimes they came when he stood at the kitchen sink, hands in warm water, shoulders finally relaxed. Sometimes they came late at night when he lay on his side and tried to keep panic from rising with every creak of the house. Each time, the sensation brought pain and comfort in the same breath. Pain, because it reminded him of how this life had begun, of the violation the system had swallowed without record. Comfort, because the child's existence was real enough to push back against the walls of his fear. And always, hovering over it all, was the strange fact that for the institution monitoring his every movement, the child did not exist at all. There was no code in the database, no diagnosis, no flagged condition. That absence felt like an ache and a shield at once. When the notification finally arrived, it was as cold as expected. No mention of human consequences, no line that acknowledged what Callum had put into motion by submitting his review request. Just a structured message, formatted in the language of outcomes. Sentence reduced. Remaining term converted to conditional release under supervision. Mandatory reporting, restricted movement, current house arrest arrangement terminated. Subject released from officer custody but retained under the oversight of the supervisory service. Wren read the words twice, eyes flicking over them as if expecting a trap in the punctuation. Released. Not free, exactly. Not safe. But not locked into Callum's house either. It meant the perimeter would change again. And with that change came the final bottleneck. To close out the pilot placement, the supervising officer had to file an end-of-program report. It was supposed to be comprehensive. Behavior. Adaptation. Risk. Medical status. It served as the formal handoff between one part of the machine and another. It was also the last chance the system had to write the pregnancy into reality. If Callum included it there, even as a note, even as a line couched in cautious language, it would trigger the automatic chain he had worked for months to avoid. The file would be flagged. A medical unit could claim authority. An investigation could reopen. The child would become not a life, but an incident. Callum sat at his desk with the blank form on his screen, the cursor blinking like a pulse. He had filled out thousands of reports in his career. His hands knew the rhythm of official language. He could have completed the template on autopilot, letting it produce the truth the system demanded. He knew exactly what the correct procedure would look like. He would note weight changes, mark hormonal deviations, attach the doctor's confirmation, enter the diagnosis code that would automatically reroute the file into a special category, flag the need for additional monitoring, request a transfer to an approved maternal unit. The form had fields for all of it, as if pregnancy were simply another maintenance issue in the machine. For a moment, he let himself imagine doing it, sending the truth, ending the deception, washing his hands of the risk. Then he pictured the consequences with equal clarity. A quiet van arriving at dawn. Wren taken back into an institution under the guise of medical care. A committee deciding what was best for reputation. A child erased, not with overt violence, but with procedure. The cursor kept blinking. Callum began to type. Behavior remained compliant. No violations of curfew or movement restrictions. No signs of aggression. Cooperation with reporting requirements remained consistent. Adaptation to structured routine improved. Engagement in educational tasks adequate. Risk of flight remained low. He filled each section with the kind of careful professionalism that inspectors praised. The report was, in every other way, flawless. Then he reached the medical field again. A simple box, a few lines, the place where one word could collapse everything. He typed, "No significant changes observed. General indicators remained within expected age and physiological parameters." The sentence looked clean. It sounded like nothing. It carried a lie large enough to reshape lives. In that report, the child did not exist. Not on paper, not in code, not in any searchable archive. The life that now pushed and turned under Wren's ribs remained outside the system's sight, protected by absence. Callum attached the routine documentation he had prepared. Older lab results, stable readings, a note about mild fatigue consistent with medication adjustment, nothing that would invite questions, nothing that would demand follow-up. Before signing, he stared at the final page for a long time. His name sat above the signature line, printed neatly by the template, waiting for his confirmation. He felt the distance between law and justice widen into something almost visible. By regulation, he was committing falsification of an official record. He understood the definition. He could write it out as cleanly as any investigator. By conscience, he was choosing which life to protect. He signed. The moment the digital signature locked into place, the report became part of the official world. It traveled into the central archive, accepted and stored with the same automated indifference as every other file. The system absorbed the lie as if it were truth. When the document finished uploading, Callum sat back, shoulders tight. He did not feel triumph. He felt the quiet finality of a door closing behind him. If this ever surfaced, there would be no reasonable excuse. He had done it knowingly, deliberately. for a reason the system would not care to understand. Upstairs, Wren found out later, when Callum handed him the release paperwork and the new supervision conditions. The words meant a chance, however imperfect, to step outside the brick house without an escort. A chance to build a life where his child might be born under a name, not a number. Relief flooded him so hard it almost made him dizzy. Then fear followed immediately, because he had lived long enough to know that institutions rarely let go of people they had once claimed. He stood in his room with the papers trembling in his hands, feeling another roll from inside his belly as if the child sensed the shift. His palm pressed over the movement, protective and instinctive. "Not yet," he whispered. "Just a little longer." Downstairs, Callum closed the laptop and stared at the dark screen. In that reflection, he saw the outline of a man who had crossed a line and could not return to the comfort of believing the rules always served the right outcome. For Wren, the Commission's decision was not a miracle. It was a narrow path. But on that path, one fact mattered more than any clause on the page. Someone in authority had chosen to stand on the side of the life inside him. In a world that had trained him to expect betrayal, that was the closest thing to safety he had ever known. A few months after he left Callum's house, Wren sat in a cramped rented flat on the edge of another city. The room was small, the walls peeled in places, and the furniture looked like it had survived too many owners. But the windows were not barred. The door did not lock from the outside by someone else's hand. And the tracking bracelet on his wrist felt less like a sentence now, and more like a scar that kept reminding him where he had been. In the corner, a cheap cradle stood beside the bed. Inside it slept a baby boy so quiet that his breathing became the softest sound Wren had ever trusted. No plastic band marked the child's wrist. No label followed him, no case number, no file that reduced him to a risk factor. To the system, the child did not exist. To Wren, he was weight, warmth, and proof. The birth had happened in an ordinary clinic with ordinary nurses and ordinary fluorescent lights. Wren had walked in under a different name and left with papers that did not point back toward prison walls. It was not magic. It was logistics, careful and cold, built from contacts Callum had gathered in silence during those last months. A borrowed identity, a discreet doctor, an appointment that did not land in the wrong queue. Wren had hated needing it. He had hated even more how necessary it was. Some nights, when the baby cried and the sound scraped Wren's nerves raw, fear rose with it, not fear of the child, fear of the past. Fear that any moment a knock would come, polite and official, and someone would ask the wrong question with the wrong smile. He learned the rhythm of survival again, keeping his head down, keeping appointments minimal, never saying more than needed. The system still held parts of him in its grip: regular check-ins, restricted movement, a supervised life, even outside a cell, but the baby's existence changed the shape of that fear. Wren could carry panic when it was only about him. He had done it for years. When it was about the small life in the cradle, panic turned into something harder. "Not you," he would whisper, barely audible, like an oath made to the air. Callum did not disappear when the program ended. He left the service before anyone could ask too many questions, before a routine audit could become a hunt. Somewhere in an archive, a resignation form sat with a neat signature at the bottom, closing the chapter of his career inside the institution he had served for so long. He traded his badge for something quieter, the right to knock on Wren's door as a man, not as an officer. At first, his visits were rare and short. He came without uniform, without authority in his posture, carrying practical things in a plain bag: diapers, formula, a small pack of clean blankets. He did not try to take over. He moved carefully, as if the space belonged to Wren's fragile peace, and he was only allowed to touch it with permission. Wren watched him with the same caution he had once used in prison corridors. Trust did not arrive all at once. It came in minor moments. In the way Callum washed his hands before holding the baby. In the way he learned to support the infant's head without being told twice. In the way he listened when Wren explained what triggered the baby's restless crying and did not dismiss it as omega nerves. There were no grand declarations, no sudden transformation into a perfect family. The bond between them grew the way bruises faded, slowly, unevenly, with tenderness and pain mixed together. Some evenings, after the baby finally slept, they sat at the tiny kitchen table and spoke in low voices about simple things: doctors, vaccinations, money, sleep. And sometimes, when the room felt safe enough, the conversation drifted into heavier territory. What it meant to live outside a system that had shaped them both, one as its tool, the other as its casualty. Ren's fear never fully vanished. He knew his file still existed somewhere under his real name. He knew people who had broken him still walked free behind official doors. He knew safety was never guaranteed, only managed. But now, fear had company. It shared space with the steady weight of a sleeping child in his arms and with the presence of a man who had risked everything so that child could be born. For outsiders, the story might have sounded like scandal. An Alpha officer falsifying reports, a pregnant Omega hidden from procedure, a baby delivered without a trace in the prison database. To Ren, it was not romance dressed up as rebellion. It was the simplest form of justice he had ever seen, someone finally looking at him and choosing to believe. And the strange part was where that belief came from. Not from family, not from lawyers, not from the people who spoke about rehabilitation in polished speeches. It came from the one person who had been assigned to watch him, contain him, and report him. If anyone had told Ren that his jailer would become the only adult who fought for his child's right to exist, he would have laughed. He would have called it a lie. He would have called it dangerous hope. Yet, on nights when the baby's fingers curled around his, Ren sat very still and listened to that tiny grip as if it were a heartbeat made visible. Outside the window, the city hummed. Inside, the cradle rocked softly with each breath. The child was not in any database. But he was here, and that was the only record that mattered. If you stayed until the end, remember this. Sometimes the people you expect only pain and control from are the ones who finally say, without speeches, "I believe you." Write in the comments whose choice felt strongest to you. Ren, who decided to survive for more than himself; Callum, who stepped out of the system to protect a life that was never supposed to be allowed; or the baby, who arrived anyway, despite every effort to erase him. Support the channel with a like and a subscription so you do not miss the next Forbidden BL story, where a new honest life begins in the most unlikely place.